Chapter 8, Using Green Light Thinking. When the author arrived at Susan Alcott's office, he found a bright, energetic young woman who was excited to share her story with him. Phil always sends people to me nowadays when he wants to illustrate a change from a negative to a positive mindset, she said with a good-natured laugh. I'm eager to learn about it, said the author. As I'm sure Phil told you, I was the wet blanket on every new idea. I went out beyond the typical job description of a skeptical chief operating officer. Luckily, at the end of my first year, Phil had a pull no punches performance review meeting with me. Pull no punches, the author said quizzically. Yep, said Susan. He was very caring, but frank and direct, he said. Susan, you're one of the best chief operating officers I've ever known. You know your field, and I can count on you to make sure we do things the right way. But you're negative. Critical mindset is driving me and everyone on our team crazy. Therefore, the number one goal I want to set with you next year is changing that mindset. I told Phil I heard him loud and clear, but I didn't know how I would accomplish that goal. From now on, he told me, every time you and I meet or you're part of any team meeting, I want you to be in charge of green light thinking. I had no idea what he meant by green light thinking, said Susan. So I asked him what it was. He told me when any new idea or project proposal is presented in a meeting, your job will be to start the discussion about why you think the idea or project is something that we should do. In other words, you will be our lead go for it person. You will hold off giving any negative response until every positive creative thought has been received from the group. If you're meeting with me one-on-one, I want to hear your possibility thinking. Susan shook her head and continued. That was a mind-boggling assignment for me, but I knew I didn't have any choice. Phil wanted me to win, but he also wasn't willing for me to continue with what he called a negative filtering system. Were you ever able to raise any objections in the meeting? The author asked. Yes, said Susan. During meetings that Phil and I had with our team, yellow light thinking was permitted to follow green light thinking. While I could not be the first one to make a cautionary statement, we were all encouraged to give our best feedback. But negative responses were never to precede positive responses. How did that process work for you? Asked the author. It was amazing, said Susan. In the beginning, I could feel myself resisting, but after a while, that changed. Because I had to focus so much on positive possibilities, when it came to putting up any yellow or red flags, I had trouble thinking of any. My focus had changed that much. Are you still able to function as well as a chief operating officer who some of the time has to say no? The author asked. Susan nodded. I think so, and so does Phil. But I'm much more pleasant to be around now that I've become a real creative possibility thinker. Without the structure of the green light, yellow light, I doubt I could have pulled it off. Did you get any other benefits from this process? Yes, I gained credibility, said Susan. When I did express a concern during yellow light thinking, people listened to me much more. Since I was no longer Miss No Can Do, they took my negative feedback more seriously. On his way out of Susan's office, the author stopped to see Evelyn to schedule his meeting with Phil the next day. She smiled and said, "Sounds like he's putting you through the paces." That's for sure, said the author with a laugh. As he walked to his car, his mind was going a mile a minute. I need to relax, he thought. Fortunately, he had scheduled a golf game with Denny, the friend who attended the golf school that focused on only a few things to learn. It was a beautiful day to play golf, and the first two holes went well for both the author and Denny. On the third hole, the author hits his second shot into a sand trap. As he approaches the trap, the author said to his friend, I hate sand traps. It's the worst part of my game. Why would you program your mind with that kind of negative thinking? Danny asked. At the golf school I attended, they told me if you think you aren't good at some part of your game, guess what? You won't be very good at it. Try something for me. All right, Mr. Know-it-all, the author said. When you enter the trap, say to yourself out loud, I love the sand. I'm going, I'm one of the best sand trap players around. And then walk into the trap acting like you are. Although he felt foolish, the author did exactly what Danny told him. Surprisingly, when he got to the ball, he felt really comfortable standing over it. He swung the club, hitting the sand a couple of inches behind the ball, and watched it as it floated out of the trap, hit a couple of feet in front of the cup, and rolled into the hole. Nothing to it, he shouted to Danny. Then they both burst into laughter. I know this stuff works, but I didn't expect it to happen quite so quickly, said Danny, as they walked onto the green to retrieve the author's ball. Neither did I, said the author, but I spent all morning learning about the power of positive thinking. That night, as the author relaxed at home, he summarized what he had learned from Phil, Susan, and he reluctantly admitted his buddy Denny. This is what he wrote. Reasons why people don't put their know-how into action number 2, negative filtering. Because we don't get unconditional love and support when we are young, we begin to doubt ourselves and doubt others. Self-doubt causes us to filter all information, whether in book, audio, video, seminar, or conversation format, through our indecisive, closed-minded, judgmental, critical, fear-ridden mindset, which leads to negative thinking. The negative thinking causes us to learn and use only a small fraction of what we see and hear. Negative thinking also causes us to achieve only a small percentage of what we could achieve. Negative thinking causes us to accept too little too soon. We grow best with a positive, open mind that ignites our creativity, ingenuity, and resourcefulness and creates possibilities beyond our expectations. We must find ways to become ready and willing to open our minds instead of trying to find what's wrong in the new information. We need to be green light thinkers who actively seek out what's right and say to ourselves, I know there's something of value in what I'm reading or I'm hearing. What is it? Changing a closed negative mindset to an open, positive mindset cannot be left to chance. Once we commit to changing, we need a specific strategy that continually reinforces our new way of thinking. The following morning, the author arrived at Phil Murray's corporate office for their next meeting. When Phil came out to greet him, he was bright-eyed and ready to go. Come on in, Phil said as he waved him inside. Just like his house, Phil's corporate office was comfortable but far more modest than the typical office of a top executive. The walls were lined with tasteful framed sports memorabilia and well-stocked bookcases. A circular table sat next to a large window that overlooked a serene woodland setting. The author couldn't wait to tell Phil about his golf experience and gave him an exciting recap as he settled into a chair at the table. Nice birdie, said Phil. Sounds like getting rid of your stinking thinking immediately improved your performance. How did you enjoy your meeting with Susan? Very enlightening, said the author. I love green light thinking. That strategy certainly gave Susan time to develop a new way to think and sort out her information, the entrepreneur commented. Apparently so, said the author. She even told me that now she has trouble providing good, negative, or cautionary feedback. Don't let her fool you, said Phil. When push comes to shove, she can still put holes in any good argument. But she also has become one of the best supporters of new ideas and projects. She's a big promoter of our Office of the Future. Office of the Future? I have no idea what that is, admitted the author. Could you explain? Sure, said Phil. About a decade ago, I realized that things are changing so fast in the world today that we have to manage that present and create the future at the same time. I realized it wasn't a good idea to have the same people managing your present who are planning your future. I'm going to reread that because I highlighted that sentence. I realized it wasn't a good idea to have the same people managing your present who are planning your future. If you do, people with the present time responsibilities will kill your future because they are either overwhelmed with the present or have vested interest in it. That's interesting, said the author. I imagine you don't find many people who are good at both future and present time thinking. That's for sure, said Phil. As a result, I designated my wife, Alice, as the head of the Office of the Future. She's one of the most positive possibility thinkers I know. She has on her staff three other people who have nothing to do with the day to day operation of any of our enterprises. Their entire job is to look into the future and attempt to see what will be happening with technology and other innovations that could disrupt any of our businesses. They really saved us in our training and development businesses after 9/11. A lot of businesses took a hit after 9/11, said the author. Most people didn't want to travel then. They sure didn't, said the entrepreneur. But Alice and her staff had been looking at teleconferencing, email, e learning, virtual meetings, and all kinds of exciting opportunities. In fact, recently, two of our trainers were in our conference building from 1 to 3 in the morning, training 120 managers across Europe in 6 different countries on the telephone with computer backup. How did the managers like the training? They loved it, said the entrepreneur. That's exciting, said the author. So you essentially have a division of your company that's run by people with a positive possibility filtering system for the future. Yes, we do, said the entrepreneur. Once again, the author pulled out his notebook. We've talked about negative filtering as the second reason people don't put their know how into action. He said as he glanced at his notes, I think I get how listening with a positive mindset and green light thinking help people overcome that. I'm ready to learn about the third and final reason. Reason number 3, lack of follow up. You're still an eager learner, said the entrepreneur with a laugh. Sounds like you're really getting some value out of what you've been learning. I am, said the author. Even beyond my golf game, the idea of actually applying and benefiting from everything I learned is very appealing. According to my notes here, you said that the reason people don't put their knowledge into action is the lack of follow up. Yes, said Phil, since some people, after they are exposed to something new, don't have a follow up plan. Guess what happens? I bet they revert back to old habits, said the author. Bingo, said Phil. People need a follow up plan to put their know how into action. That's exactly what I did with Susan. After I convinced her that she had a negative filtering system that made her a wet blanket for new ideas, if I hadn't put a follow up plan together, I doubt any change would have occurred. She might have tried to listen more openly for a while, but eventually her old habits would have taken over. The author nodded. That reminds me of something Peter Drucker was quoted saying: nothing good happens by accident. That's so true, said Phil. To change behavior and get the results you want, you need structure, support, and accountability. When all three of those are in place, you have a good follow-up plan. And the third reason people don't put their know-how into action, lack of follow-up, is the most difficult roadblock of all. That's why you need a plan. Why do you say that it's the most difficult roadblock? Said the author. Let me start with some historical background, Phil replied with a thoughtful look. I learned the importance of having a good follow-up strategy from my father. He was a master cabinet maker from Germany. He told me, and again over and over, never to take a job unless I was willing to be mentored. That's powerful right there. I'm going to repeat that again. He told me again and again never to take a job unless I was willing to be mentored. What did he mean by that? The author asked. He meant that he wanted me to be willing to work under somebody who really knew how to do what I wanted to learn. My father was the best teacher I've ever had or ever known. His follow-up learning system was simple. He would tell me, show me, let me, correct me, tell me, show me, let me, correct me, tell me. Dot, dot, dot. He would do this over and over again, our old friend repetition, until he hammered home whatever he was telling or showing me, continued Phil. For example, my first bike, we picked it up at the junkyard, hauled it home, and took it apart. He showed me how to put it back together again. how to fix the brakes, build a gear, put a new spokes on the wheels, and give it a complete overhaul. Then, to my dismay, after we had it all put back together, he made me take it all apart again. I did it over and over to the point I could almost put it together with my eyes closed. That must have been some experience, said the author. He certainly provided structure and accountability. He certainly did, said Phil. My dad was instinctively doing the right thing. He was following up on what he showed me. His system made sure that I understood the correct way of doing something from the very start. I get that, said the author. Without immediate follow up after being exposed to new ways of doing something, you will revert back to your old ways. What really helps, said Phil, is to start practicing right away. The quicker you use a newly acquired skill, the more likely it is that you'll master it. But remember, said the entrepreneur, make sure that what you're practicing, you're doing it in the right way. As my father put it, practice doesn't make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect. I'm going to repeat that. Practice doesn't make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect. All this talk of practicing a new skill right away reminds me of school, said the author. I don't know how many times I wound up cramming for an exam. If I had simply gone over my notes on a day to day basis, cramming for an exam would have been unnecessary. When I crammed, I was essentially learning that content all over again. Always did better if I kept up with the work. It was the same with repairing bicycles, said Phil. My father's follow up plan was to get me practicing the skills as soon as possible, as much as possible, and then hold me accountable for my performance. He supervised my practicing until he felt I could do it on my own. Even during your rebellious teens? Asked the author. Even then, replied the entrepreneur. When I was a teen, my dad bought me an old car that we had to have towed home. I didn't know the difference between the transmission and the master cylinder or the headgears, headers, and the exhaust pipes. I was a complete novice. Together, we took each section apart, and then he'd tell me and show me and let me correct me, etc., until I knew how to put each piece back together. And then guess what? He would take it completely apart again and say, with a smile, put it together, and it's yours. I bet that was challenging, said the author. It sure was, said the entrepreneur. But can you imagine how psyched I was to do it right? My dad really turned me on to the fact that learning doesn't just happen in your head, it happens when you have a plan to help you do something with what you know. I've become a lifelong learner because I now believe successful people yearn to learn and have a plan for learning. Successful people yearn to learn and have a plan for learning. Unless people are motivated to learn to do something and have a plan to do it right, it isn't very likely that they'll hang in there and learn how to do it well. My dad created a need and a plan for me to merge with that car. It was part of me. One of my saddest memories is the day I joined the military and sold my ancient Model A. How about after you left home? Asked the author. Were you able to stick with the follow up habit you learned from your father? I was, said Phil with a smile. When I arrived at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, I set records taking machinery apart and putting it back together, starting with a rifle. I could do it faster and better than anyone, thanks to my dad. In many ways, it is the secret to all my success and to the creation of our training and development programs. If you can't use what you know, what good is it? I hear the pride in your voice and the gratitude to your father, said the author, but I didn't hear you mention much about support. Isn't that the third ingredient for an effective follow up plan? Phil Murray's face became very somber. Guilty as charged. While my father wanted me to succeed, gave me plenty of structure, and held me accountable for my performance, I wouldn't describe him as a supportive person. So, he never caught you doing anything right? Asked the author. Why do you put it that way? Asked Phil. Of all things I've ever taught or written about, the most important to me is the power of catching people doing things right, said the author. To me, the key to helping people develop and creating a new, great organization is to accentuate the positive. When it comes to training people and helping them develop, I always tell managers, don't wait until people do things exactly right for you. Praise them before you praise them. In the beginning, their performance may be only approximately right, but that should be praised. Praise progress because you're dealing with a moving target. When you can correct them, or as I would say, redirect them so they can continue to improve, then you can correct them, or as I would say, redirect them so they can continue to improve. I hear what you're saying, but that wasn't my father's way, said Phil. While I know my father wanted me to be successful, he never, using your terms, caught me doing something right. He always jumped to how I could do it better. It was years before I realized the negative impact that had on me. How so? Asked the author. It affected my relationships, for one thing, the entrepreneur said slowly. When I was selling insurance, I recruited several hundred agents in 1 year. As you can imagine, I had a lot of training to do, telling, showing, letting, and correcting. One day, an agent leaned over and said, Phil, an occasional pat on the back would be good for everyone. How did you respond? Asked the author. I thought long and hard about it, said Phil. I realized right away that he was right, but I needed to figure out how to do it. Don't feel like the only one, said the author. Most of us are much better at catching each other doing things wrong rather than right. I realize that now, said the entrepreneur. But I also learned that if people are deprived of praising, either way, either they give up trying and never are very successful, or they become driven. Driven? Really? So, yes, said the entrepreneur. I am almost possessed by the desire to achieve and be successful. What I finally realized is that I am still looking for my father's approval. That highlights my problem with your father's follow up plan, said the author. It has no step where the person gets an attaboy or an attagirl. After the let me step, I would have expected a praise my progress step before the correct me step. You're right. My father's follow up system should have included the positive step, but that was not his way. We actually do have that important step when we use the follow up system with our people. And that's the result of our brave HR director, Herb Goodson, who confronted me on it and insisted it be changed. Thanks to Herb, we now use all three techniques to help people get past the problem of lack of follow up. Besides providing necessary structure and accountability, our company follows up plan includes support by accentuating the positive. I'd love to talk to Herb, said the author. Great idea, said the entrepreneur. You know how to make that happen. I'll talk to you later.